Hey, this is Joel with American Giants. I thought we would talk today in this episode about a story that's not directly tied to International Fiberglass or Muffler Men, although some people have claimed it is. It's a story behind a picture that I probably receive a few dozen times every Christmas. It makes the rounds and circulates on Facebook, and it's about a massive Santa statue that was in Dallas, Texas in 1953. So after a number of years of getting this picture in my inbox, which is a fascinating story, and I'm always thankful for the pictures that you all send to me when you find things, but I thought it would be something fun to look into this fascinating story from 1953 about this massive Santa statue that literally sat on top of a Chevy dealership. "5526 East Mockingbird, Dallas, Texas. It might not look like much today, just an empty parking lot, but this unremarkable location in Dallas holds some fascinating giant history. Making headlines as far away as Atlanta and New York City, the massive Santa statue measuring 85 feet long and 56 feet tall sat on the roof of the Porter Chevrolet building across from the Dr. Pepper Company. And just as quickly as he popped up, the massive giant disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a story of tragedy and a handful of pictures that continue to find their way onto Facebook posts each and every Christmas. The Santa story starts with a man named John Porter, a World War II vet and a former used car salesman from San Angelo, Texas. Many years after this story, San Angelo would become home to a Mr. Bendo Muffler Man that stood at Marvin Philippe's auto garage, but that is about as close as a Muffler Man gets to this story, despite some Facebook posts claiming there is a connection. John had opened his new Chevy dealership in January of 1953 after moving to Dallas, and after a year of operations, he was looking to boost sales for the Christmas season. In September of 1953, John, armed with a sketch of a massive Santa, went to the Dallas City Council for their permission and blessing to plant the big man 56 feet above grade on the roof of his business. The idea was that a full-size automobile would safely fit on his lap, and that the structure of the Santa would support the car. The council gave Porter some ground rules, that the Santa had to be fireproof, and could only sit on the rooftop from November 15, 1953 through January 4, 1954. And all of these rules were agreed to by Mr. Porter. Armed with permission, John returned to his dealership and got permission from the Dr. Pepper plant across the street to use their name in his advertising. Just across the street from the Dr. Pepper Company. John had already been looking for giant makers that could help his dream come to life, and I imagine it was a relatively short list. It didn't take long for John to locate Jack Bridges, who had become well known for creating big techs for the state fair. In 1951, just a few years before, State Fair President R.L. Thornton had asked Jack to transform a 49-foot tall Santa from Karen's into big techs. The 49-foot Santa was converted into a yearly tradition of big techs that continues to this day. Bridges, with the help of 11 men, got right to work on the new Santa plan for Porter Chevy and spent 2 months working on the project at his studio just a few miles away. Jack Bridges gave a few interviews during the construction of the massive giant, made from steel and paper mache, complaining about the fact that the giant was sitting, and this created extra challenges. The hardest part was coupling the Santa's bent-over torso with his fat steel legs. Because of his size, much of the construction was done outside the studio in the yard. The boots alone were almost as tall as the roof of the building. Once the engineering was complete, the Santa was hauled in pieces on separate trucks. The torso was so large that wheels had to be added directly to it, and it was rolled down the road, because there was no trucks in Dallas large enough to haul it. Once the pieces arrived on Mockingbird, across from the Dr. Pepper plant, the FS Old Crane Operating Company was selected to lift the giant pieces into place. 46-year-old Ray V. Davis was one of the superintendents at the company and was heavily involved in the operation to get Santa set up. Just days before, he had been released from the hospital after another flare-up of heart problems that had plagued him for years. After the giant was assembled, a real 1954 Chevy Bel Air was hoisted into Santa's lap, and his hands were positioned to look like he was holding the car, as if it was a toy. Happy with the completion of the massive operation, Roy instructed his crane operators to lift him and co-worker C.J. Robertson up to the face of the Santa for a Christmas card selfie of sorts. Both men were on separate cables and ascended at the same time. Roy was sitting on a small wrecking ball and holding onto the cable when he suddenly passed out, lost his grip, and fell 35 feet, landing on the concrete between the giant's massive boots. Within mere minutes of John Porter's promotional dream coming to fruition, tragedy had struck, tarnishing local news stories on the Santa. Roy had suffered a myocardial rupture just seconds after Joe Laird snapped this photo and was already unconscious when he hit the ground. The exciting event had turned tragic, and co-workers and crane operators sat in stunned silence as the reality set in of what had happened. Paramedics and an ambulance were called, and Roy was rushed to the hospital, where he would die just a few hours later. The Santa spectacle still ran in newspapers nationwide, and those articles never mentioned what had happened to Ray. By January 10, the Santa was gone, and the story and the giant Santa were lost to time, only to be discovered decades later in archival pictures. The entire publicity event was a disaster for John Porter, and just 3 months later, he sold his Chevy dealership. So that is the fascinating story of the massive Santa, and a bit of a tragic story as well. And it's probably what has helped make that Santa and that story so infamous all these years later. Certainly no connection to International Fiberglass, but a fascinating story nonetheless.